This is Amid Yomi Gemara and Shabbos. Daf Mem Zayin Amid Beis. We're holding the top of Mem Zayin Amid Beis, and we just finished explaining the chilek between Takua and Rafui. Incredible differentiations all the way to the world of halacha, which is the difference between if you put together a keli, Rafui, loose, or if you put it together strong, Taka. Says the Gemara, we begin with a story in the second line of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. Rav Chama Avimita Galanita had a bed made out of sections of Imahadale B'Yom Taiva, and they would put it together in Yom Tov. Amalei Humi Rabbanu L'Rava, my Daitach, how to do this? Beimin Asadu, is it because you're building it in an indirect manner? Nehidi Sidaraisa Leka. They asked the Rav, I understand. You're building Minat Sad, so it's not a Daraisa. But he's doing the Rabbanon Miyayika to sell me the Rabbanon. So Amar Le, Rava responded, Akrashbag, clearly, to Amar my Rafui Mutter. As long as it's Rafui, it's Mutter, and they built it Rafui. And we wrap up the Perek with a Mishnah. A Mishnah which hopefully should sound familiar. We had this a few days ago. You're allowed to put a kli under an air to catch the sparks. But you're not allowed to put water inside this kli. Why? Because the sparks are going to fall into the water and you're going to cause the sparks to be extinguished. So firstly, the Gemara begins with a piece of Gemara that we've seen already. Asks the Gemara, 1 second, you're being mevatel the kli by putting it under the sparks. Now you're not going to use it anymore over Shabbos. Answers the Gemara, it's not a problem. So the nitzitzis fall, the sparks fall into the kli, they disappear, and therefore the kli will not be muksa. And then we deal with the end of the Mishnah that said, you can't put in water, why not? Because you're extinguishing the sparks. Says the Gemara, should we say this time Mishnah is like Rav Yosi Damar Goyrem Likiboy Aser? This time Mishnah is Rav Yosi who says Gram Kiboy is going to be Aser. It's going to be a Mishnah towards the end of the Masechta and Daf Kov Chaf. That, what's the story when you want to save a fire from spreading? So the Tanakama said, the question is about putting out water, etc. So Rav Yosi comes along and says that you can't put out a earthenware keli that's filled with water. Why? Because it's going to break the keli. Let out the water and put out the fire. That's called gram kiboy. And gram kiboy, Rav Yosi holding is aser. But in our Mishnah, says the Gemara, it says you're also not allowed to put the kli with water, seemingly, because gram kiboy. So I asked the Gemara, it sounds like the Mishnah is only fitting with Rav Yosi and not the Tanakama. Responds the Gemara, V'tizbra, 5 lines to the end of the Perek. Does this make any sense to you? When did Rav Yosi say that you're not allowed to indirectly cause a fire to be extinguished? B'Shabbos. But when are you putting out the kli in our case? B'Erev Shabbos mi Amar. And in our case, we're not allowing to put out the kli on Erev Shabbos. So how could it be that it's only with Rav Yosi? Maybe you're telling me that the Mishnah talking about on Shabbos. Can't be. Vatani, we have a rice that says put a kli under a vessel to catch the sparks. B'Shabbos. B'Shabbos. Erev Shabbos. You can't put water in it because it puts out the sparks. So as the Gemara, the Brisa clearly explains the Mishnah both in Erev Shabbos and on Shabbos. So how can you tell me that it's only like Rav Yosi? Rav Yosi's din is only on a Shabbos din, not a Friday din. Explains the Gemara, Elam Ravashi, if you look at him Rabbana, the Gemara, the Mishnah could work, even with the Rabbanan who generally hold gram kiboy is not us. Shiny hach, our case is different. They should make karev as kiboy because it causes the kiboy to happen faster. In the case of that we quoted on Kov Chaf, when you're putting up vessels with water, that if the fire goes, it's going to burst them and open them up. There, what's going to happen? The fire is going to burst open the kli, and it's going to potentially put out the fire. But in our case, when you put the water underneath the lamp, can actually directly put out the sparks. Why? Because the fire is lit, and therefore there are sparks flying. So if I slide under a bowl of water, at that moment, a spark might fall into it. So it's not gram kiboy. It might be at that precise moment, I'm actually putting out a spark. And therefore, it's much more chamer, says the Gemara. And therefore, that's the reason why the Mishnah can even fit with the sheet of the Rabbanon. And once we're saying it's even the Rabbanon, then it's a Gezerah. You can't even do this on Friday, because we're afraid you might have to do it on Shabbos, which is a malacha gemura. Hadron aloch hiram, short parak, dealing with many of the halachas of Bishol. We should do a chazara, but for now we continue the halachas of Bishol with the halachas of Atmana. Atmana being, as we'll see, submerging something in a heat source or some level of heat source that retains the heat. And let's remember, times Chazal, they didn't have a lot of the fancy appliances we had. So you have a pot of soup, you want to keep it hot, you take it, you stuff it in the ground, maybe take some hot ashes and you surround it, etc., etc. Begins the Mishnah. With what do you let it insulate a pot, and with what do you not let it insulate a pot? So the truth is, we must see the first Rashi. Rashi begins and explains. You're taking a pot off the fire, and you want to hide it, you want to hatmana, you want to insulate it in something else. You're not allowed to do atmana, you're not allowed to insulate in something that increases the heat. Only something that retains the heat, and which we'll have to see what that means. And now the Mishnah continues. Rashi adds in those critical words that the Mishnah is explaining. What are the items that add on heat and therefore are ulcer? Says the Mishnah, manure, salt, lime, sand, dry or wet. Straw, grape skins, other types of grasses and whatnot are only ulcer when they're moist. But you can ask to atmana when they're dry. Again, different properties of these items, whether they increase the heat. Some of them is both wet and moist, and dry, Some of them are only when they are wet. We'll stop over here. We'll pick it up from here. B'siyata d'shmaya in the next shiur.